Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Professor Tyson, I've got a question for you. In your testimony that you submitted to the committee, you state that, quote, scoring conventions ignore the stimulative effects of a cut in rate on future growth, close quote. Do you think it would be appropriate for Congress to consider dynamic scoring of corporate tax reform packages?
I'm afraid I have to leave this up to the Congress. What my remarks would say, you probably missed Kevin's remark when you were not here. I mean, he said, and I think it's right, we are all dealing, economists are dealing, and the Congress is dealing with models of corporate tax effects which are out of date relative to corporate reality, relative to the mobility of capital income, relative to competitive conditions around the world. So I do believe that the competitive effects of the kind of corporate tax reform that I've been discussing are significantly larger than traditional economic models and dynamic scoring models would allow. What's important for me to emphasize here is that the Alliance for Competitive Taxation and a lot of members of the business community in the corporate sector believe that they're willing to say we can get to a rate that we think significantly improves our competitive situation, paying for it with getting rid of preferences and credits without dynamic scoring. We believe it's going to be better than that, but we aren't proposing that you do that. And I think that's an important point. I mean, if you want to try alternative models, I think that's great, but I think that the proposal is we can get a competitive tax rate that's paid for by base broadening without making assumptions about the dynamic effects, even though I personally believe in the dynamic effects.
Okay. And you personally believe in them and such that if we were to use them, we'd probably get more accurate scoring. But you're saying we don't have to get there with what you're talking about, as much as it would be good, much as you would welcome seeing that. Okay. Dr. Hassett, any thoughts you have on dynamic scoring that you'd like to share along those lines?
Well, sure. I think that ideally we'd be basing our judgments on the best estimate of what might happen, and we're not doing that. And as I said a little bit earlier before you arrived, that I think that it ends up creating almost a theater of the absurd, where we're using scores that we don't think really have much to do with reality to tie ourselves into knots. And for me, I think that absent the score, having a new scoring debate and establishing new procedures, that I think exercising humility on both sides and being willing to learn is something else that you could do. So that make a small temporary tax change and then watch what happens to revenue and then start to learn how tax changes affect revenues and then collectively decide what the right thing to do is. Instead, what we're doing is tying ourselves in knots because we can't come up with something that pleases these scoring models that have nothing to do with reality. And that gridlock has been with us really since President Clinton made a very, very small change in the corporate rate while the rest of the world has been cutting its rate. And so I think we have to fix this system of scoring because it's become an obstacle to competitiveness.
Yep. Back to Dr. Tyson for a minute. In a piece you recently wrote in Project Syndicate, I think it was in March, you discussed, among other things, the difficulty of doing corporate tax reform comprehensively absent any changes to the treatment of pass-throughs, LLCs or other businesses that pay, other businesses as to which taxes are typically paid through the individual side of the code. Do you think corporate-only tax reform is a viable option, and how do you think this would change the competitive position of small businesses relative to large corporations due to the tax code?
Let me say that I did preface that statement in Project Syndicate with the observation that I think it is not desirable to have a corporate tax code which distorts choice of organizational form when everything is similar about the organization except whether it checks a S Corp or a C Corp box. So that's an inefficiency from an economist's point of view. I actually think that the best answer to this was, again, given by my colleague, Dr. Hassett, who said, you know, if we had the right, well-designed corporate tax reform with an appropriate rate, a lot of businesses that are currently choosing other organizational forms would choose the corporate form. This is a form choice, and it depends upon the tax system, and we could get rid of this organizational form sort of distortion by one really good form for, and I would say right now it would be called corporate tax form, but a lot of companies would organize in that way. I think that therefore, what I prefer is to focus on getting the corporate tax reform right, and then that will allow businesses to choose the form of taxation which is the most appropriate for them.
Okay. You're saying corporate form is itself a dynamic response.
I guess I do. I guess I think that. And by the way, the governor and I have agreed on a lot of things, but I personally feel that, again, since I think we are on the road to possible, meaningful, sensible corporate tax reform, and I can see the political way to do that, perhaps, I would hate to see that get blocked because we're trying to get comprehensive all tax reform, and then forget no tax reform.
Thank you. See, my time's
Mr. Chairman, may I answer the Senator's question?
Very quickly, yes, sir.
Senator, the answer is yes. We should consider dynamic scoring. Now, when we put together our program at Free Congress, I asked my economists to do a revenue-neutral, static approach because I didn't think politically it would be acceptable otherwise. But we all know there's going to be dynamic pluses. And Kevin Hastert's right. Try it. You'll see that it'll work. And then we'll learn something about economics.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you. On behalf